sweat stung her eyes. The radio crackled with the panicked screams of men who, just 3 hours ago, joked she couldn't carry her own rifle weight. Now they were pinned down, bleeding out. They needed a miracle. What they got was a pissed-off woman with a bolt-action .338 Lapua. The staging area smelled like diesel exhaust and stale sweat. It was a cavernous aircraft hangar on the edge of a nameless airstrip in the Levant, illuminated by humming, flickering fluorescent lights that cast sickly yellow shadows over the gear laid out on the concrete. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes sat cross-legged on a Pelican case. She was feeding 250-grain hollow-point boat-tail rounds into a heavy steel magazine. Click. Press. Click. The repetitive, tactile sensation was the only thing keeping her grounded. 50 yards away, the Joint Task Force Assault Element was reviewing the raid plan. They were a mix of Army Rangers and attached conventional intelligence assets. Bruisers who measured a soldier's worth by the width of their shoulders and the bass in their voice. Hayes wasn't looking at them, but she didn't need to. She could feel their eyes. She knew the whispers. The military had integrated the SEALs, but policy didn't rewrite human nature. To the older brass, she was a liability, a political stunt who had somehow managed to get a trident pinned to her chest. Colonel Briggs, the task force commander, walked over. He was a man carved from old-school doctrine, his boots polished even in a combat zone. He stopped 3 feet from Hayes, holding a rolled-up topographical map. He didn't look at her. "Chief," Briggs barked, addressing Chief Petty Officer Davis, who was quietly stripping a carbine at the table beside Hayes. "You sure your Overwatch element is good for a 5-click hump with full kit? Terrain's mostly broken concrete and rebar. No shame in letting the Rangers take the high ground and keeping your personnel in the Tactical Operations Center." Davis didn't stop wiping down his bolt carrier group. He didn't even look up. "Commander Hayes leads the pace, sir. I just try to keep up." Briggs's jaw tightened. He finally shifted his gaze to Hayes. It was a flat, assessing look. He saw a woman standing 5'9", lean, her face streaked with a mixture of dust and camouflage paint. He didn't see the thousands of hours on the range. He didn't see the sniper school records she'd broken. He just saw a woman holding a rifle that looked too big for her. "Your call, Commander," Briggs said, the title sounding like an afterthought. He handed the map to Davis, not her. "Hour is 0200. Don't fall behind." Briggs walked away. Hayes didn't flinch. She just picked up the next brass cartridge. Click. "You want me to bounce a wrench off the back of his head, boss?" Davis murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Save your energy, Chief," Hayes said, sliding the loaded magazine into her chest rig. "He's about to have a very long night. Let's move." The infiltration was a grueling, agonizing ghost walk. There was no moon. The world was reduced to the monochromatic green glow of their night vision goggles. The air was thick, tasting of copper, raw sewage, and pulverized brick. Hayes carried 95 pounds of gear. Her primary weapon was an Accuracy International AXMC, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. It weighed 20 pounds on its own. Add the tripod, the spotting scope, the radios, water, and extra ammunition, and every step was a calculated negotiation with gravity. The pain in her shoulders started at kilometer 2. By kilometer 4, it was a dull, roaring fire radiating down her spine. She didn't slow down. She kept her breathing steady. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A rhythmic, mechanical process. The Rangers had pushed out ahead, moving toward the primary target, a fortified compound holding a high-value arms facilitator. Hayes and her 3-man element, Chief Davis, Petty Officer Blake, and her spotter, Collins, split off. Their destination was a bombed-out 4-story apartment building. positioned 600 yards north of the target compound. The climb up the stairs was treacherous. The stairwell had taken a mortar round months ago. Rebar jutted from the walls like twisted, rusted bones. They stepped carefully, avoiding the debris that would echo through the dead city if kicked. They reached the 4th floor. It was a gutted living room. A faded, floral armchair sat bizarrely intact in the corner, covered in an inch of grey dust. "This is it," Hayes whispered over the internal comms. They went to work in absolute silence. Collins deployed the camo netting, creating a dark void in the shadows of the room, ensuring the lenses of their scopes wouldn't reflect whatever ambient light bled through the ruined walls. Hayes set up the tripod. She locked the heavy rifle into the saddle. She lay prone behind the gun. She pressed her cheek to the stock, feeling the familiar, unforgiving chill of the metal against her skin. She dialed the magnification on her Schmidt and Bender scope. Through the glass, the target compound leaped into focus. High walls, concertina wire, a heavy iron gate. "I have the objective," Hayes breathed. "Ranging," Collins whispered beside her. His eye pressed to the spotting scope. "Gate guard. Range 640. Wind is 3 miles per hour. Full value from the left." "Copy," Hayes said. She didn't adjust her dials. She knew her holds. Now they waited. Combat is 99% excruciating boredom, followed by 1% of unadulterated terror. The adrenaline of the hump faded, leaving behind a cold, creeping dampness. The concrete floor sucked the heat from her chest. Her muscles cramped. She ignored them. She stared through the glass, letting the reticle become the center of her universe. Dawn broke like a bruised peach. The sky turned a sickly shade of purple, then a blazing, dusty orange. With the sun came the heat. It didn't rise gradually. It slammed into the room, baking the concrete and drawing out the smell of dried urine and rotting garbage from the corners of the apartment. Sweat pooled at the small of Hayes's back. A fly buzzed lazily around her ear. She didn't blink. Her eye remained fused to the optic. Down below, the city began to wake. The distant hum of a moped, the barking of a feral dog. "Anvil element is crossing phase line Alpha," the radio crackled in her earpiece. It was Briggs, monitoring from the TOC miles away. His voice was calm, dripping with the confidence of a man looking at blips on a screen rather than staring down a dark alley. Through her scope, Hayes watched the assault force stack up outside the compound's southern wall. They were ghosts in the grey morning light, shadows moving against shadows. Breaching in 3, 2, 1, a muffled thump echoed across the valley. A cloud of pulverized brick plumed from the compound wall. The Rangers poured through the opening. For exactly 10 seconds, it looked like a textbook raid. Then the world tore open. It started with a singular, terrifying sound. The heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun. It wasn't coming from inside the compound. It was coming from a rooftop across the street, angled perfectly to fire directly down into the courtyard where the Rangers had just bottlenecked. Immediately, the radio erupted into chaos. "Contact! Contact front and elevated. We are taking heavy fire." Sparks showered through Hayes's optic as heavy armor-piercing rounds chewed through the concrete walls of the target compound. She saw a Ranger go down, grabbed by his plate carrier and dragged behind a shattered fountain. Then came the RPGs. 2 rockets streaked from a 3rd-story window to the east, detonating against the breach point, collapsing the wall further and sealing the Rangers inside the courtyard. They were in a fatal funnel. It was an ambush. The intel hadn't just been bad, it had been planted. "Anvil actual. This is Anvil 2. We are pinned. We have 2 KIA, 3 wounded. We cannot move." The voice on the radio was frantic, stripping away the bravado from the briefing room. It was the sound of a man watching his friends bleed out. Briggs came over the net, his voice suddenly tight, the false confidence gone. "Anvil 2, this is TOC. Fall back. I repeat, fall back to the rally point." "We can't, goddammit. The breach is collapsed. That heavy gun is chewing us up." Hayes felt her heart rate spike, but her hands were entirely still. Her training overrode her biology. The cynical part of her brain noted that Briggs had just ordered dead men to walk. The TOC had lost the bubble. They were looking at maps. She was looking at reality. She bypassed Briggs entirely. "Anvil 2, this is Overwatch," Hayes transmitted, her voice chillingly calm, cutting through the panicked screaming on the net like a scalpel. "I have your heavy gun. Keep your heads down." "Target acquired," Collins said beside her, his voice tight but steady. "Rooftop, northeast corner. Range 680. Wind is shifting. Call it 5 miles. Half value." Hayes found the DSK gunner in her scope. He was a broad-shouldered man, leaning into the spade grips of the massive weapon, brass casings raining down onto the tin roof below him. She didn't think about the politics. She didn't think about Briggs. She only thought about the geometry of violence. She adjusted her breathing. Exhale. Pause. The crosshairs settled directly over the gunner's chest. Her finger applied steady, rearward pressure to the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. A violent, concussive roar filled the ruined apartment, kicking up a cloud of dust. The smell of burnt gunpowder flooded her nostrils. Through the scope, the violence of the impact was instantaneous. The 250-grain bullet crossed 680 yards in less than a second. It struck the gunner center mass. He didn't fall. He was violently thrown backward, separated from the heavy gun as if hit by an invisible truck. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud stopped abruptly. "Good impact," Collins said dryly. "Gun is down. Anvil 2, heavy gun is neutralized," Hayes reported. "Prepare to move your wounded." "Copy Overwatch, but we still have..." Before the Ranger could finish, the courtyard was raked by a fresh torrent of AK-47 fire. The enemy realized their heavy gun was down. They were adapting. Men were pouring out of the surrounding buildings, swarming the high ground around the compound. They knew the Rangers were trapped. It was a turkey shoot. "Overwatch! They're moving on the west wall. We're taking enfilade fire." Hayes racked the bolt. The spent brass casing ejected, pinging against the concrete floor. She pushed a fresh round into the chamber. "Collins, feed them to me," Hayes said. Her voice wasn't human anymore. It was a machine engaging its primary function. 3 targets, 3rd floor balcony, west building, range 615. Hayes swung the heavy rifle. The friction locks on the tripod groaned slightly. She found the balcony, 3 men with AKs, leaning over the railing, pouring fire down onto the trapped Americans. The timer in her head started ticking. If they stayed there for another 30 seconds, the Rangers would be wiped out. "Left target," Hayes said. Bung. The man on the left crumpled over the railing, his rifle clattering to the street below. She racked the bolt, fluid, mechanical. "Center target." Bung. The second man dropped out of sight. The third man realized what was happening. He stopped firing at the courtyard and looked frantically toward Hayes's position. He raised his rifle. He was too slow. Bung. He pitched backward into the dark interior of the apartment. "Balcony clear," Collins reported. "Shift right. Street level. Alleyway approaching the breach. 2 men with RPGs. Range 590. Hayes pivoted the gun. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but she leaned into it. She found the alleyway. The men were running, hoisting the green tubes onto their shoulders. "Moving targets," she muttered. She tracked the lead runner, pulling the reticle slightly ahead of his path to account for his speed and the flight time of the bullet. Exhale. Bung. The runner's legs gave out instantly. He skidded face first into the dirt, the RPG tube bouncing harmlessly away. The second man stopped, turning to run back the way he came. "Don't let him get away," Collins urged. Hayes racked the bolt, tracked, and fired. Bung! The man fell flat, a dark stain rapidly expanding on the back of his shirt. Sweat was pouring down her face now, stinging her eyes, mixing with the dust. The apartment was filled with acrid smoke. 5 shots, 5 dead. Less than 90 seconds had passed. Down in the courtyard, the Rangers were dragging their wounded toward the shattered breach point, trying to establish a perimeter. "Overwatch, this is Anvil 2. You're buying us time, but they're massing on the north side. We need a medevac now." On the command net, Briggs finally found his voice. "Anvil, medevac is 20 minutes out. It's too hot. We can't bring a bird in there until you secure the immediate area." Hayes gritted her teeth. 20 minutes might as well be a decade. If the enemy massed a ground assault, the Rangers' ammunition would run dry long before the helicopters arrived. She pulled her eye from the scope for a fraction of a second to look at Collins. "They're going to rush the courtyard," Hayes said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Find the squad leader. Find the guy organizing them." Collins swept his spotting scope back and forth across the northern street. I'm looking. Wait. Ground floor, the blue building. Man in a black vest. He's waving them forward. He's organizing a breach on the north wall." Hayes found the blue building. Through the haze of smoke and dust, she saw him. A man barking orders, pointing toward the trapped Americans. 4 other fighters were stacking up behind him. "Range?" she demanded. 550. He's partially obscured by the doorway. Hayes stared at the target. She only had a visual on his shoulder and a sliver of his chest. It was a low-percentage shot. If she missed, he would trigger the assault. She settled her breathing. The roaring in her ears vanished. The screaming on the radio faded to background noise. There was only the crosshair, the wind, and the man in the doorway. She squeezed the trigger. The 250-grain hollow-point boat-tail bullet ripped through the narrow opening of the doorway. It didn't cleanly pierce the man in the black vest. It shattered the heavy wooden frame first, turning jagged splinters of timber into secondary shrapnel. Before the deformed slug caught him high in the collarbone, he dropped like a puppet with its strings violently severed. There was no theatrical backward stumble, just an instantaneous collapse into the dust. The 4 fighters stacked behind him froze. In urban combat, hesitation is a fatal currency. Hayes worked the bolt. Click, clack. The heavy brass casing ejected, spinning through the air and joining the growing pile near her right elbow. The smell of burnt gunpowder was overwhelming now, thick and acrid, burning the back of her throat. "Left to right," Hayes rasped. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was a mechanical, hollow sound, stripped of adrenaline and replaced by cold, mathematical focus. Bung! The second man in the stack took a round directly to the pelvis. The concussive force spun him around violently, dumping him onto the pavement where he lay screaming, his rifle skittering away into the gutter. Bung! The third man tried to turn and sprint back into the safety of the blue building's interior. The bullet caught him squarely between the shoulder blades just as he crossed the threshold. He ploughed forward, face first into the concrete, unmoving. The remaining 2 fighters didn't wait. They abandoned their wounded, scrambling frantically over the rubble to break the line of sight, vanishing into the deep shadows of the ground floor. Down in the courtyard, the radio crackled. "Overwatch, this is Anvil 2. The north assault is broken. They're falling back. Outstanding shooting. But we are pinned tight, and we have movement on the east road. Sounds like heavy armor. They figured out where we are." Chief Davis growled from his position near the rear wall. As if on cue, the ruined apartment shuddered. A deafening, continuous roar of incoming 7.62mm fire slammed into the exterior wall. Plaster, pulverized concrete, and lethal chunks of rebar rained down from the ceiling. A jagged piece of brick ricocheted off the floor and clipped Hayes's helmet, snapping her head down. She ignored it. She couldn't afford the luxury of flinching. "Muzzle flashes!" Collins yelled over the deafening noise, his eye still jammed against the spotting scope. "Second floor, white building directly across our front. They're trying to suppress us." Davis moved seamlessly to the shattered window frame, keeping his profile low, and pushed the barrel of his M4 carbine through a gap in the debris. He began firing controlled, rhythmic bursts across the street, throwing suppressing fire back at the enemy to disrupt their aim. "I'll keep their heads down," Davis shouted over his shoulder. "You focus on the threats to the Rangers, Commander." "I see the armor," Collins said, his voice straining. "East Road, moving fast toward the Ranger courtyard. It's a technical, rusted Toyota Hilux. It's got a DSHK heavy machine gun mounted in the bed." Hayes shifted her body weight, fighting the heavy friction locks of the tripod. Her right shoulder was a deep, throbbing mass of bruised muscle. The repeated recoil of the .338 Lapua was taking its toll, sending shockwaves down her spine with every trigger pull. Sweat poured into her eyes, burning fiercely, but she didn't blink. She found the street. The truck was bouncing violently down the cratered road, kicking up a massive plume of grey dust. "Range to the truck?" Hayes demanded. 400, moving at 20 miles an hour. Angle is steep, wind is dead." Hayes aimed at the windshield. The glare of the rising sun made the glass completely opaque, turning it into a sheet of white light. She couldn't see the driver. She had to guess his position based on the geometry of the vehicle and the silhouette of the steering column. She pulled the reticle slightly ahead of the truck's bumper. She didn't hold her breath. She fired precisely at the natural pause of her exhale. Bung! The bullet punched a clean, fist-sized hole through the passenger side windshield, deflecting slightly, but finding flesh. The truck swerved violently to the left, jumping the high concrete curb. It slammed head-on into a thick concrete utility pole with a sickening crunch of tearing metal. The impact threw the gunner in the back of the truck forward, smashing his chest against the heavy weapons mount. "Driver is down," Collins reported. "But the gunner is still up." Through the optic, Hayes watched the gunner pull himself up. His face was a mask of blood, but he blindly reached for the DSHK's spade grips, racking the heavy bolt backward to chamber a round. If he pulled that trigger, he would pour a devastating volume of fire directly into the Ranger's casualty collection point. Hayes cycled her bolt. Her hand was slick with sweat and grease. Bung! The gunner slumped backward over the tailgate, dead before his knees hit the rusted bed of the truck. The apartment was now a chaotic mess of sound and choking dust. Bullets snapped through the open window with supersonic, whip-like cracks. The air tasted of copper and pulverized earth. "We have infantry pushing the collapsed breach," Anvil 2 screamed over the command net. The panic was back, raw and unfiltered. "They're inside our wire. They're inside the courtyard." "Talk to me, Collins," Hayes ordered. The barrel of her Accuracy International AXMC was radiating intense heat, creating a thick mirage effect in her scope. The world beyond the glass was waving and distorting. She fought to see through the blur. "Range 410, inside the compound courtyard, far right corner by the fountain," Collins directed quickly. Hayes swept the rifle down. She found them. 2 enemy fighters had slipped past the Rangers' suppressed perimeter while the technical was drawing their attention. They were flanking the Americans. One of them had a Russian fragmentation grenade in his right hand. He was pulling the pin, preparing to lob it over the concrete barrier where the medics were treating the wounded. There was no time for a perfect breathing cycle. There was no time to calculate the exact windage. Hayes slammed the bolt forward, putting the crosshairs dead center on the man's chest. Bung! The high-velocity round obliterated his sternum. He was thrown backward instantly, the live grenade dropping from his limp fingers into the dirt beside his feet. The explosion a second later tore through the dust, catching the second man in the legs. He went down hard, screaming, but he didn't stop fighting. He began crawling frantically toward the cover of a rusted water tank, raising his AK-47 blind with one hand and spraying bullets indiscriminately into the courtyard. Hayes cycled the action one last time. Her index finger was bruised, her shoulder completely numb. Exhale. Bung. The crawling man went still. And then a profound, eerie silence fell over the city. It didn't happen all at once, but rather in a rapid, cascading decrescendo. The incoming fire against their apartment building stopped as Davis's suppressing fire found its mark. The frantic screaming in the courtyard ceased. The only sound left in the world was the high-pitched ringing in Hayes's ears and the heavy, ragged breathing of her spotter beside her. "Anvil 2, this is Overwatch," Hayes said. Her throat was bone dry. "Courtyard is clear. Perimeter is static." There was a long pause on the radio. Then the Ranger squad leader replied. The panic was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, stunned exhaustion. "Copy, Overwatch. We are secure. We owe you one, Commander." "Medevac is inbound," Briggs's voice finally chimed in from the TOC. It sounded small, distant. Less than a minute later, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of UH-60 Blackhawks vibrated through the ruined concrete floor. The birds flared over the compound, kicking up a massive dust storm as they touched down in the courtyard to load the American wounded. Hayes finally pulled her right eye away from the scope. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor. Her joints cracked loudly. Her muscles screamed in protest, locked tight from the tension and the unnatural prone position. She looked at her watch, wiping the grime from the glass face. From the first shot that killed the heavy machine gunner on the roof to the final round that stopped the flanker in the courtyard, exactly 4 minutes and 48 seconds had passed. 12 shots, 12 confirmed dead. She looked at Davis. The chief was lowering his rifle, his face coated in white plaster dust, leaving only his eyes visible. He looked at her, looked at the smoking barrel of the .338 Lapua, and gave a single, slow nod. 2 hours later, they were back in the cavernous, humming aircraft hangar. The adrenaline had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. Hayes was sitting on the exact same Pelican case she had occupied before the mission. She had stripped the AXMC down, methodically cleaning the bolt carrier, wiping the carbon away with practiced, repetitive motions. Colonel Briggs walked over. He didn't have his topographical map this time. His boots were scuffed with fresh mud, and the sharp crease in his uniform was gone. He stood 3 feet from her. This time, he looked directly at her. He looked at the bruised cheekbone where the rifle's stock had repeatedly struck her face. He looked at her blistered hands. Briggs opened his mouth to speak. He tried to find the words, an apology, an acknowledgement, a concession to the shifting paradigm of the military he had dedicated his life to. But he couldn't. He was a man built for orders, not introspection. Before he could force out a sentence, a shadow fell over them both. It was the Ranger squad leader, Anvil 2. His uniform was soaked in blood, not his own. He looked exhausted, haunted, but entirely present. He walked right past Colonel Briggs without offering a salute. He stopped in front of Hayes. He didn't offer a flowery speech. He didn't talk about heroism or breaking glass ceilings. He just extended a dirt-caked hand. Hayes put down her cleaning rag and shook it. His grip was iron-tight. "Good shooting, Commander," the Ranger said quietly. "Just doing my job, Sergeant," Hayes replied. The Ranger nodded once, turned, and walked back toward his men. Briggs stood in silence for another few seconds, then quietly turned and walked back to his command tent. Hayes didn't watch him leave. She picked up her rag, picked up her rifle bolt, and went back to work. If this story got your pulse pounding, do not leave just yet. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on these raw, unfiltered stories from the front lines. Share this video with someone who needs to hear what real grit looks like. Drop a comment below. Would you have the nerve to take that exact shot? We will see you in the next mission. Stay frosty and keep watching.